If you want a case study in just because you can doesn't mean you should, look at the Tupolev Tu-104. The Soviets basically took a strategic bomber, bolted airliner seats into it, and called it the future of civil aviation. And for a brief moment it was. The Tu-104 was the brainchild of Andrei Tupolev, who was an old lion of Soviet aviation. He'd started out before the revolution at the Moscow Imperial Technical School, helped build the Russian National Research Center for Aviation into the USSR's main aero lab, then somehow kept designing airplanes through the worst of the Stalin years, including a stint designing from inside a prison after he was arrested in the purges. His name sat behind almost every big Soviet machine that mattered. In the 1920s and 30s, you see his TB-1 and TB-3 heavy bombers teaching Soviet industry how to build big all-metal airframes. In the war, you get the Tu-2, a fast twin bomber that crews actually liked. After the war, he calmly reverse-engineered the American B-29 into the Tu-4, and then pushed into the jet age with the swept-wing Tu-16 nuclear bomber. Decades of that had shaped the way he thought. Use what already works, scale it up, hit the deadline, don't give the politicians an excuse to turn on you. So, when Moscow suddenly decided it needed a jet airliner to show the world, there was no other man to turn to. By the early 1950s, you can see why they came knocking. In the West, airline flying was sliding into a golden age, but inside the Soviet Union, it felt very different. Aeroflot's big machines were a generation behind. For a regime obsessed with showing off modernity, that was painful. By the early 50s, they weren't just a bit behind, they were cornered. They needed a modern airliner just to keep up. To add salt to the injury, de Havilland rolled out the Comet, the first jet-powered airliner. The Comet flew nearly twice as fast as the piston airliners people were used to, and cruised 15,000 feet higher. Getting there hadn't been cheap or easy. The Comet was the end result of years of expensive lessons on how to hang jet engines on an airliner without killing everybody on board. Jets were still a young technology, but to anyone paying attention, it was obvious this was where airline flying was headed. One of the persons paying attention was Andrei Tupolev. Tupolev saw jets as the way to drag Soviet air travel into the modern world. A jetliner like the Comet could cut flying times by a third and make long-range travel feel normal instead of heroic. The snag was, Moscow wanted Comet-level glamour without paying Comet-level time and money for years of trial and error. Tupolev worked around that. He told the brass he could build a jet in 3 years, carry more passengers than the Comet, and do it for far less. And if it worked, it would show the world the USSR could match the West. To build a jetliner like the Comet in only 3 years, you have to cut corners, and that's exactly what Tupolev did. Tupolev grabbed the Tu-16 bomber, a brand new swept-wing nuclear bomber he'd just finished, because its wings, tail, engines, gear, and systems were already flying and already in production. If he reused most of that, he could skip years of clean sheet design. The one thing he couldn't reuse was obviously the fuselage. Bombers only need space for fuel and bombs, but an airliner needs a cabin. The Tu-16's narrow tube couldn't take a real cabin, so the Tu-104 got a new circular, fully pressurized fuselage about 3.5 meters across, with a cabin a little over 3.2 meters wide. That gave it space for roughly 50 seats, galleys, and baggage holds without squeezing everyone like sardines. To bolt this new cabin onto bomber hardware, they built a lower keel section, so the bomber's wing structure could mount as a low wing on the airliner. The engines stayed the same. The Mikul and AM-3s in the Tu-16's wing roots were already in mass production for both the Tu-16 and the M4 bomber, and they were the only high-thrust, non-afterburning jets the Soviets trusted. Designing a new civil engine wasn't happening on a 3-year timeline, so keeping the Tu-16 wing planform solved range and fuel volume needs, and while the heavy wing sweep is good for speed at altitude, it wasn't ideal down low. But avoiding a new wing design saved months the program didn't have. For the same reason, the tail and nose came straight from the bomber family. The Tu-104 used the Tu-16's tailplane and fin with the gunner's position deleted and the tail reshaped. Up front, it kept the glazed bomber nose with a navigator still sitting down there, now paired with civil nav and weather radar in a radome underneath. Inside the structure, they reused everything that made sense. landing gear layout, fuel and hydraulic plumbing, electrical gear, avionics racks. So the production line didn't have to learn a new airplane from scratch. By the time Tupolev was finishing the Tu-104, everyone already knew the jump into jets was going to hurt. The Comet had started breaking up in flight. The British grounded it in 1954 and then spent years tearing the airframe apart to figure out why. So when the Tu-104 went into service, the Soviets suddenly had the only jet airliner in the world actually hauling passengers. And instead of reading the Comet as a warning, they pushed their jet straight into front-page service to score propaganda points. And just like any rushed first-generation machine, it started throwing up problems fast. And some of those problems were nasty. From the cockpit side, it never became a nice airplane. Crews didn't warm to it because it quickly built a reputation as twitchy and unforgiving. Controls felt heavy and a bit lazy. It would wander into Dutch roll, and as you brought the speed back, it had this habit of pitching up in a way nobody had seen on the piston airliners it replaced. Compared with its peers, the Tu-104 made pilots work hard all the way around the pattern. You were wrestling heavy forces, waiting for slow reactions to inputs, and babysitting an autopilot and trim system that could leave the jet snaking in yaw until you snapped the automation off and flew it by hand. Down the final approach, that big swept wing and that weight made the slow end of the envelope scary. Everyone's biggest fear was stalling close to the ground, and they dealt with it the simplest way they could, by flying the jet faster than the book. Instead of trusting the numbers, they started adding 50 kilometers per hour to the approach speed, so real-world landings around 270 kilometers per hour became normal just to stay well clear of the stall margin. And while that kept the wing happy in the flare, it immediately turned the next phase into a headache. The Tu-104 always arrived hot and heavy on relatively small runways, and then had to stop quickly without thrust reversers, and the wheel brakes weren't built for that sort of kinetic energy. There is a drag chute to help with stopping the airplane, but there was a catch. You can only deploy if you are sure you will stop in the runway remaining, since it had to be repacked after every landing. If you pop and go around, you don't have a chute for your next landing. Crews griped about that setup for years, and the system basically shrugged. Then 1958 hit, and the airplane started doing things you couldn't pin on clumsy flying. In February, a GSA Tu-104 hit turbulence. Both engines flamed out, and the jet dropped about 20,000 feet before the crew managed to get them lit again. A month later, another Tu-104 ran into rough air and did the opposite trick, pitching hard nose up and climbing all the way to around 44,000 feet, way beyond its comfort zone, before it stalled, tumbled, and somehow still came back under control. Soviet officials did nothing but blame it on the pilots, but they made a U-turn when an Aeroflot flight crashed, killing everyone on board, and another one carrying diplomats broke up mid-air, killing all on board. The investigators eventually joined the dots and realized that the Tu-104 was easy to load with the center of gravity too far aft, especially on stretched, high-payload flights. Pack the cabin with people and bags towards the back, don't balance it properly up front, and the CG slides rearward. That means the horizontal stabilizer has less authority to hold the nose down, so the jet is already flying light on the nose before anything happens outside. So throw a strong updraft into that setup. The whole airframe suddenly meets air coming up from below, the angle of attack jumps, the wing's center of lift walks forward like it does on most highly swept wings, and the airplane naturally wants to pitch even further nose up. In a well-behaved design, you just push, add a bit of power, the tail wins the argument, and you level off. In the Tu-104, with the CG too far aft, the tailplane and elevator often didn't have enough authority left in that regime to drag the nose back down, and the engines didn't have the spare thrust to keep climbing safely at that new, steeper angle, so the jet could get stuck in a climb it simply couldn't sustain. There is a saying that a nose-heavy plane flies terribly, but a tail-heavy plane flies once. Once it was in that corner of the envelope, the crew could be doing the right things, forward pressure, power on, and still not get a guaranteed recovery before the wing ran out of lift and the airplane stalled and fell out of the sky. That's why the fixes look so blunt. They forced crews down to around 29,000 feet so the jets stayed away from the highest, roughest air. They tightened loading rules so the CG stayed well forward, and they tweaked tailplane settings to fight the nose-up pitch harder. All of that was basically an admission that the airplane only behaved itself inside a fairly narrow weight and altitude box. And even with those limits in place, a Tu-104 in 1959 still hit an updraft and only just avoided becoming the next crater. By that point, this one's CG geometry trap had already killed about 144 people. From there, the accident list just kept growing. Through the 1960s and 70s, you see Tu-104s showing up in reports for all sorts of reasons. An emergency landing on a frozen pond near Sverdlovsk in 1961 after the crew shut down the wrong engine. A Sheremetyevo test flight that crashed when the rudder controls were accidentally rigged backwards. A CSA jet gutted by a refueling fire in Bombay. Hard arrivals and runway overruns at Vladivostok, Omsk, and Chute. A left-engine fire that brought Flight 3843 down in flames outside Alma-Ata, and even a hijacked Flight 109 blown apart over the taiga near Chute when the bomber detonated his device. The last big civil hit came in 1979 outside Moscow, when Flight 1691 tried to turn back to Vnukovo after a false engine fire alarm and flew into the ground short of the runway, killing more than half the people on board, and finally convincing Aeroflot to pull the Tu-104 out of frontline passenger service. Between 1958 and 1981, at least 16 Tu-104s were lost, from Sverdlovsk and Sheremetyevo to Alma-Ata and Vnukovo, and roughly 1,140 people died in crashes on the type. By the late 60s, new Soviet jets were coming online, the Tu-124, 134, and the later Tu-154. These were clean-sheet airliners designed as airliners, not bombers with seats. They were easier to fly, safer, and didn't carry the Tu-104's reputation or its accident stats, with around 1 in 5 104s destroyed and more than 1,000 people dead. Once those types proved themselves, the Tu-104 had already done its propaganda job, and its safety record was a liability, so the Soviets quietly pulled it from passenger service in the 70s and finished retiring it after the last military crashes in the early 80s. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.